The tray of glass vials slipped from Elena's hands the moment the floor shook beneath her feet. She had exactly 4 minutes to reach the North Hall before the gathering began, and she was already running, her shoes slapping against the cold stone floor of the fortress corridor. The vials shattered behind her, but she didn't stop. Being late to a meeting of the Pax was not something a healer's assistant could afford. Not today. Not when every alpha from every territory was inside those doors, deciding the fate of the coming season. She turned the corner too fast. The corridor was crowded with guests, in fine coats and formal dresses, all moving toward the same set of doors, and Elena tried to weave through them, whispering apologies she didn't have time to finish. Someone's shoulder clipped hers. Her foot caught the edge of a raised stone tile that had never bothered her before in 3 years of walking these halls. And suddenly, the world tilted sideways. She threw her hands out, expecting the hard floor, expecting pain, expecting the humiliation of falling in front of half the leadership of the Northern Territories. Instead, she hit something solid and warm. 2 arms closed around her, before she even understood what was happening, catching her weight like she weighed nothing at all. For a second, she couldn't breathe. Not from the fall. From something else entirely, something that moved through her chest like a current of electricity, sharp and immediate, the kind of feeling that didn't ask permission before it arrived. She looked up. The man holding her had eyes the color of storm clouds, gray and deep, and they were fixed on her with an intensity that made the noise of the hallway disappear. He was tall, broad through the shoulders, dressed in dark formal clothing that marked him as someone important, though Elena's mind was too scrambled to place exactly who. His jaw was set, his expression unreadable, but his hands, still holding her steady, had gone very still. "I'm so sorry," Elena managed, her voice barely above a whisper. "I didn't see the step. I wasn't looking." "You're not hurt," he said. It wasn't a question. His voice was low, controlled, but there was something underneath it, something that sounded almost surprised. No, I'm fine, thank you." Neither of them moved. It should have taken a second, maybe 2, for him to set her back on her feet, and for her to step away and continue running to wherever she'd been going. Instead, they stood there, his arms still around her hands still pressed flat against his chest, and the crowded hallway seemed to fade into something distant and unimportant. Elena could feel his heartbeat under her palm, steady, then suddenly not so steady at all. Someone gasped nearby. A woman's voice, sharp with disbelief, cut through the moment. "Is that the Alpha King?" The words hit Elena like cold water. She pulled back so fast, she nearly stumbled again. And this time he let her go, though his hands lingered a moment longer than necessary, as if some part of him didn't want to release her. She looked at him properly now, really looked, and her stomach dropped. She knew that face. Everyone in the Northern Territories knew that face, from portraits and formal announcements and the stories told about him in hushed, respectful tones. Cale Ashford, Alpha King, ruler of every pack, gathered inside that hall, the most powerful man for 1,000 miles in any direction, and she had just fallen directly into his arms in front of half his court. "I am so sorry," she said again, and this time her voice shook. "I wasn't watching where I was going, and I should have been more careful, and I didn't mean to." "You don't need to apologize." His voice was calm, but his eyes hadn't left her face, not once. "Are you certain you're unhurt?" "I'm fine, really. Thank you for catching me." He said nothing to that. He simply looked at her, and something passed behind his eyes that Elena didn't understand, something heavy and searching, like he was trying to solve a puzzle that had just landed in his arms without warning. The silence stretched a beat too long, long enough that people around them had started to notice, had started to whisper, had started to slow their steps to watch. Elena felt her face flush hot with embarrassment. "I should go. I'm already late." "Wait." The single word stopped her, before she'd even taken a step. She turned back, and he seemed almost as surprised by his own request as she was. "What's your name?" he asked. "Elena. Elena Voss." He repeated it quietly, like he was testing the shape of it in his mouth. "Elena Voss." Then, after a pause that felt far too long for a simple introduction, he added, "Be more careful on these floors, Elena Voss. I won't always be standing here to catch you." There was something in the way he said it, Something that wasn't quite a joke and wasn't quite serious either, that made her chest tighten in a way she didn't have a name for. She managed a small nod and turned, walking quickly down the corridor, refusing to look back, though every step felt like it was pulling against some invisible thread connecting her to the place she'd just left. She didn't see the way he watched her go, didn't see the way his jaw tightened, didn't see the way his hands, now empty, curled slightly at his sides, as though searching for the weight they'd just lost. By the time Elena reached the healer's station at the edge of the North Hall, her hands were still trembling. She pressed them flat against the wooden counter, trying to steady her breathing, trying to make sense of what had just happened. She had fallen, that was all. She had fallen, and the Alpha King happened to be standing there, and he had caught her, and that was the end of it. People fell all the time. It meant nothing. Except it didn't feel like nothing. It felt like something had shifted inside her chest, some small door she hadn't known existed swinging open and refusing to close again. She could still feel the warmth of his hands through her sleeves, still hear the low steadiness of his voice, asking if she was hurt, still see the particular way his eyes had held hers, like he was seeing something in her that no one else had ever bothered to look for. "You're late," said a voice beside her, and Elena jumped. Mira, the senior healer she assisted, was watching her with a raised eyebrow, a stack of linens balanced against her hip. "And you look like you've seen a ghost. What happened?" "Nothing," Elena said quickly. "I tripped in the hallway. It's fine." Mira's eyebrow climbed higher. "You tripped, and now your hands are shaking like that." "I said it's fine." Mira didn't push further, though the look she gave Elena suggested she didn't quite believe her. She handed over the stack of linens and gestured toward the supply room. "We have wounded soldiers coming in from the border patrol later this evening. I need everything ready before sundown." Elena nodded, grateful for the distraction, and threw herself into the work. Sorting bandages, checking the stock of healing herbs, refilling water basins, anything to keep her hands busy and her mind occupied, anything to stop replaying the 2 minutes in the hallway, over and over in her head, like a song she couldn't stop humming. It didn't work. By the time evening fell and the wounded soldiers began arriving, Elena had convinced herself the entire encounter had been a strange, embarrassing accident that would be forgotten by morning. The Alpha King had far more important matters to attend to than a clumsy healer's assistant who couldn't watch where she was walking. He would forget her name by the time he sat down for dinner. She was certain of it. She was wrong. 3 floors above the healer's station, in a private council chamber overlooking the fortress courtyard, Cale Ashford sat at the head of a long table, half listening to a border dispute between 2 lesser packs, his mind entirely elsewhere. He kept seeing her face, the wide, startled eyes, the soft brown hair that had come loose from its pins during the fall, the way her hands had felt pressed against his chest, small and warm, and the way something in his chest had responded to that touch with a force he hadn't experienced in longer than he could remember, if he had ever experienced it at all. He was the Alpha King. He had faced down rival packs, negotiated treaties that prevented wars, made decisions that shaped the lives of thousands of people across dozens of territories. He did not lose focus in council meetings. He did not think about the way a stranger's heartbeat had felt beneath his palm, hours after the moment had passed. And yet here he was. Alpha Ashford? Cale blinked, realizing the room had gone quiet. Every eye at the table turned toward him, waiting for a response to a question he hadn't heard. He straightened in his chair, forcing his expression back into the calm authority his position demanded. "Forgive me. Repeat the request." The pack leader who had been speaking, an older man named Dorian Blackwood, repeated his question about grazing rights along a disputed border, and Cale answered with the precision and clarity his advisors expected of him, his voice giving no indication that his thoughts had been anywhere else at all. But they had been, and they remained there long after the council meeting ended, long after the candles in his private study burned low, long after the fortress had gone quiet with the settling of night. He found himself standing at the window of his chambers, looking out over the courtyard below, thinking about a woman he had known for less than 5 minutes. Elena Voss, a healer's assistant, judging by the plain, practical clothing she'd worn, the kind of clothing that marked her as someone who worked with her hands, someone far removed from the nobility and pack leadership that filled the halls of his fortress during gatherings like today's. She was nothing like the women his advisors had been presenting to him for the past 2 years, each one more polished and politically advantageous than the last, each one meant to secure an alliance, or strengthen a border, or please some council of elders who believed the Alpha King needed a Luna chosen for strategy, rather than feeling. He had met every one of them with polite indifference. He had felt nothing. He had known Elena Voss for less than 5 minutes, and he had felt more in that brief collision than he had in 2 years of careful, calculated introductions. It didn't make sense. It shouldn't have been possible. And yet the memory of her voice, apologizing over and over, the memory of her eyes widening in recognition when she realized who he was, the memory of the particular warmth that had spread through his chest the moment she landed against him, all of it sat heavy and undeniable in his mind, refusing to be dismissed as coincidence. He thought of the old stories his grandmother used to tell him as a child, stories about bonds that arrived without warning, connections between two people that formed the moment their paths crossed, whether either of them wanted it or not. He had always considered those stories to be exactly that, stories. Old traditions meant to comfort young pups who dreamed of finding someone destined for them in a world that rarely offered such certainty. He was no longer certain they were only stories. A knock sounded at his door, and Cale turned from the window, schooling his expression back into something composed, before calling for his visitor to enter. It was Garrick, his second-in-command and closest advisor since childhood, a broad-shouldered man with sharp eyes that missed very little. "You left the reception early," Garrick said, closing the door behind him. "Lady Seraphine noticed. She asked after you twice." Cale said nothing, turning back toward the window. Garrick studied him for a long moment. "Something happened today." "Nothing happened. Cale." Garrick rarely used his given name, reserving it only for moments when he felt the situation required honesty rather than formality. "I've known you since we were pups. Something happened." Cale exhaled slowly, his hands braced against the windowsill. He hadn't intended to say anything, hadn't fully processed the events of the afternoon well enough to put them into words, but Garrick's steady, patient silence had a way of pulling truth out of him that few other things could. "There was a woman," he said finally, "in the hallway before the reception. She fell, and I caught her." Garrick's expression didn't change, though something flickered behind his eyes. "That's all?" "That's all that happened." Cale turned to face him. "But it isn't all that I felt." The room went quiet. Garrick crossed his arms, leaning back against the door, waiting for Cale to continue, understanding, without being told, that whatever his alpha was about to say mattered more than the simple facts of a stranger's fall in a crowded hallway. "I felt something the moment she touched me," Cale said slowly, choosing each word with care, as though testing whether saying it aloud would make it more real or less. "Something I've never felt before, not with any of the women Elder Thorn has paraded through this fortress, not with anyone." "A pull," Garrick said quietly. Cale looked at him sharply. "You believe in that?" "My grandmother spoke of it. So did yours, if I recall correctly." Garrick's voice remained even, but there was something careful in it now, something weighing the implications of what his alpha had just described. "Who is she?" "Elena Voss, a healer's assistant." Garrick was quiet for a long moment. "Not exactly the match the council has been hoping for." "I'm aware. Lady Seraphine's family has been positioning her as Luna for over a year. The Eastern Alliance depends on it, in part." "I'm aware of that as well." Cale's voice hardened slightly, though not from anger at Garrick. From the weight of what he already understood was coming, the resistance he would face, the arguments he would have to fight through, before he even understood what he wanted for himself. "I'm not asking you to solve this tonight, Garrick. I'm only telling you what happened." Garrick studied him for a long moment, before nodding once. "Then I'll say only this. If it's real, what you felt today, it won't fade because it's inconvenient. Believe me, I've watched enough alphas try to ignore it over the years. It doesn't work." Cale said nothing, but his eyes drifted back toward the window, toward the darkened courtyard below, and somewhere beyond it, toward the healer's quarters where he knew, without having been told, that Elena Voss was likely still awake, still working, entirely unaware of the storm her simple fall had set into motion. He didn't sleep well that night. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw her face, startled and apologetic, looking up at him with an openness that no one in his position ever offered him anymore. Everyone who spoke to him now measured their words, calculated their approach, understood exactly who he was, and adjusted themselves accordingly. Elena hadn't done any of that. She had simply looked at him like he was a person who had caught her, nothing more, nothing less, and something about that simplicity had cracked something open inside him that he hadn't realized was sealed shut. Down in the healer's quarters, Elena lay awake in her narrow bed, staring at the ceiling, listening to the quiet breathing of the other assistants asleep in the room around her. She told herself it meant nothing. She told herself the Alpha King had likely already forgotten the entire incident, that men like him did not spend their evenings thinking about clumsy assistants who tripped over raised floor tiles. She told herself the strange warmth still lingering in her chest was simple embarrassment, nothing more, the natural result of falling in front of an important stranger. But when she closed her eyes, she didn't see embarrassment. She saw storm-gray eyes, watching her, with an intensity she'd never experienced before, and she heard a low, steady voice, asking if she was hurt, and she felt, again and again, the particular warmth of strong arms catching her before she hit the ground. She didn't understand it. She had never believed in the old stories about bonds forming in an instant, about two strangers recognizing something in each other that neither of them could explain. Those were stories told to children, stories meant to make the uncertainty of finding love feel less frightening. And yet, sleep, when it finally came for her, was restless and full of storm-gray eyes. She woke before dawn, as she always did, and threw herself into her work, with the same determination she always carried, checking supplies, preparing the healer's station for the day, trying very hard not to think about corridors or falls or Alpha Kings who had no business occupying so much space in the thoughts of a woman he had known for less than 5 minutes. It should have ended there. A single strange, electric encounter, embarrassing and unexpected, filed away as an unusual story to tell in years to come. But fate, as Elena would soon learn, rarely settled for a single meeting when it had decided two people belonged together. 3 days later, a formal summons arrived at the healer's quarters, addressed directly to her, bearing the seal of the Alpha King himself. Elena stared at the folded parchment in her hands, as though it might burn her fingers. Mira stood beside her, equally stunned, reading the elegant handwriting over her shoulder. "It says you're to report to the private council wing at midday," Mira said slowly, "for a medical consultation." "I've never treated anyone in the private council wing in my life," Elena said. "Why would they summon me specifically?" Mira's eyes narrowed with suspicion, though her voice stayed carefully neutral. "Perhaps someone remembered you from the reception." Elena's stomach dropped. She hadn't told Mira the full truth of what happened in that hallway 3 days earlier, only that she had tripped and been caught by a stranger. She certainly hadn't mentioned that the stranger had been the Alpha King himself, or that she had spent 3 sleepless nights unable to stop thinking about the way his eyes had held hers. "It's probably nothing," Elena said, folding the parchment carefully. "Probably one of the guards needs a wound checked, and they simply requested whoever was available." Mira didn't look convinced, but she let the subject drop, and Elena spent the rest of the morning trying to focus on her duties while her mind raced ahead to midday, circling the same unanswerable question over and over. Why would the Alpha King request her, specifically, by name? When the hour finally arrived, she smoothed down her healer's uniform, tied her hair back as neatly as she could manage, and made her way through the fortress corridors toward the private council wing, a part of the building she had never once been permitted to enter in her 3 years of service. A guard at the entrance checked her name against a list and waved her through without a word, leading her down a hallway far grander than anything in the healer's quarters, with polished stone floors and tall windows that let in streams of afternoon light. At the end of the hallway, he stopped before a heavy wooden door and knocked twice. "Enter," came the voice from inside, and Elena's chest tightened at the sound of it. Low, controlled, unmistakable. The guard opened the door and gestured her through, then closed it behind her, leaving her alone in a private study with the Alpha King of the Northern Territories. Kale stood near the window, his hands clasped behind his back, and when he turned to face her, something in his expression shifted, softened slightly, though he quickly composed himself into the calm authority Elena imagined he wore for everyone. "Elena," he said, "thank you for coming." "Of course, Alpha Ashford." She dipped her head respectfully, unsure of the proper way to address him, unsure of anything about this strange, unexpected meeting. I was told this was a medical consultation. It is. He gestured toward a chair near his desk, and Elena sat, though she perched at the very edge of it, her hands folded tightly in her lap. I've had a persistent pain in my shoulder since a training session last week. Our head healer is occupied with the wounded soldiers from the border. I thought perhaps you could look at it. It was a reasonable explanation. It was also, Elena suspected, not entirely true, though she couldn't have said exactly why she felt that way. Something in the careful way he'd delivered the words, something slightly too rehearsed, made her wonder if the shoulder pain was real at all. She approached him carefully, professionally, the way she'd been trained, and asked him to remove his outer coat so she could examine the joint. He did so without hesitation, and Elena pressed her fingers gently along his shoulder, testing the range of motion, watching his face for any sign of genuine discomfort. There was none, not even a flicker. "Does this hurt?" she asked, pressing slightly harder. "No. And this?" "No." She stepped back, folding her arms, studying him with a look that was far less deferential than she probably should have allowed herself in the presence of the Alpha King. "There's nothing wrong with your shoulder, is there?" For a moment, he said nothing, and then the corner of his mouth lifted, just slightly, the closest thing to a smile she had seen from him. "No, there isn't." "Then why did you summon me?" He was quiet for a long moment, his gray eyes studying her with the same intensity she remembered from the hallway 3 days earlier, and when he finally spoke, his voice had lost some of its careful formality. "Because I couldn't stop thinking about you," he said simply. "And I didn't know how else to see you again, without raising questions I wasn't ready to answer." Elena's breath caught. Whatever she had expected walking into this room, it hadn't been honesty this blunt, this unguarded. From a man whose entire life was built on careful diplomacy and calculated words. "I don't understand," she said quietly, though some part of her did understand. Some part of her had felt exactly the same pull for 3 sleepless nights, and hadn't known what to call it either. "Neither do I," Cale admitted. "I've never experienced anything like what happened in that hallway. Not with anyone. I've spent 3 days trying to convince myself it meant nothing, and I've failed every single time." Elena sat back down slowly, her legs suddenly unsteady beneath her. "You're the Alpha King. You could have anyone in the Northern Territories. Why would you spend even a moment thinking about a healer's assistant you barely know?" "I've asked myself that question 100 times, he said, moving to sit across from her, close enough that she could see the faint lines of exhaustion around his eyes, evidence of sleepless nights that matched her own. "I don't have an answer that makes logical sense. I only know that when you fell into my arms, something in me recognized something in you. I know how strange that sounds." "It doesn't sound strange," Elena said before she could stop herself. "It sounds exactly like what I've been feeling too, and I've spent 3 days telling myself I was imagining it." Something shifted in his expression. Something like relief, mixed with an emotion far more complicated. "You felt it too." "I did." Her voice was barely above a whisper. "I don't know what it means. I don't know if it means anything at all, but I haven't been able to stop thinking about it either." They sat there in silence for a long moment, the weight of mutual admission settling over the room, neither of them entirely certain what to do with the truth they had just exchanged. "Tell me about yourself," Cale said finally, not as a healer's assistant, as Elena Voss. The question caught her off guard, gentler and more personal than anything she had expected from him. She hesitated, unused to anyone asking about her life with genuine curiosity rather than polite obligation. "There isn't much to tell," she said. "I grew up in the eastern villages, near the river. My mother was a healer, and I learned from her before she passed 3 years ago. I came to the fortress because it was the only place with enough training resources to let me finish what she started." "You lost your mother." "Yes. I'm sorry." The simple sincerity in his voice caught her off guard, and for a moment, Elena found herself telling him more than she had intended, about the small village she'd grown up in, about the years spent learning herbs and remedies at her mother's side, about the loneliness of arriving at the fortress with no family and no connections, only her skill and her determination to make something of the training her mother had begun. Cale listened to all of it with a focus that made her feel, for the first time in longer than she could remember, genuinely seen. He asked questions, small ones, thoughtful ones, about her favorite remedies, about whether she missed the village, about what she hoped for beyond her current position. No one had asked her these questions in years. No one at the fortress had ever seemed to care about the answers. In turn, he told her small things about himself, things she suspected very few people ever heard, about the weight of ruling territories he'd inherited far younger than he'd expected to, after his father's sudden passing, about the loneliness of a position that surrounded him with advisors and allies but very few genuine friends, about the years of careful, calculated meetings with women chosen by his council, none of whom had ever made him feel the way 5 minutes in a crowded hallway had made him feel. The conversation stretched far longer than any medical consultation should have, and neither of them seemed to notice the passing time, until a soft knock interrupted them, followed by Garrick's voice from the hallway, reminding Cale of an approaching meeting he could not miss. Elena rose quickly, smoothing down her uniform, suddenly aware of how much time had passed, and how unusual this entire meeting would appear if anyone learned the truth of it. "I should return to the healer's quarters," she said, "before anyone begins to wonder why I've been gone so long." Of course, Cale stood as well, and for a moment, neither of them moved toward the door, both of them reluctant to end the conversation, despite knowing it had to end. "Elena, thank you for indulging my invented shoulder pain." A small laugh escaped her, before she could stop it, the first real laugh she'd allowed herself in days. "I hope your shoulder recovers quickly, Alpha Ashford." "Cale," he said quietly, "when it's only the two of us, call me Cale." She nodded, though she wasn't certain her voice would cooperate if she tried to speak his name aloud in that moment. She turned toward the door, and as she reached for the handle, his voice stopped her one more time. "Will I see you again?" Elena turned back, and the honest, uncertain hope on his face, so different from the composed authority he wore in front of his court, made something in her chest ache with a warmth she didn't fully understand yet. "I hope so," she said, and meant it more than she had meant anything in a very long time. She left the private council wing in a daze, walking back through the grand hallways toward the healer's quarters, her mind spinning with everything that had just happened. She had gone in expecting a simple medical consultation, and left having shared more of herself with the Alpha King of the Northern Territories than she had shared with anyone since her mother's passing. She didn't notice, as she walked, the pair of sharp eyes watching her from a shadowed alcove near the council wing entrance, eyes belonging to a noblewoman whose polished, calculating expression had shifted into something colder the moment she saw Elena emerge from Cale's private study. Lady Seraphine had spent over a year positioning herself to become the next Luna of the Northern Territories, carefully cultivating alliances, carefully securing her family's support among the council elders, carefully ensuring that no other candidate stood close enough to threaten the future she had built for herself. She had not expected a plain healer's assistant to become a problem. She watched Elena disappear down the corridor, her jaw tight, her mind already working through the possibilities of what she had just witnessed, and what she intended to do about it. Whatever this was, whatever strange connection had formed between the Alpha King and this unremarkable young healer, Seraphine intended to end it before it had the chance to become something neither of them could walk away from. For the next 2 weeks, Elena told herself the meeting in the private council wing had been a strange, singular occurrence, unlikely to repeat itself. The Alpha King had far too many responsibilities to spend his afternoons inventing shoulder injuries just to speak with a healer's assistant. Whatever had passed between them in that room had been a moment out of time, and moments out of time did not become anything more than memories. She was wrong again. Cale found reasons to visit the healer's quarters that grew increasingly difficult to justify. First, it was a genuine injury among his personal guard that required his presence during treatment. Then it was a question about herbal remedies for a headache that had plagued him for days, though Elena suspected the headache, like the shoulder before it, existed mostly in his imagination. Then it became simpler still. He simply appeared, walking the corridors near the healer's station in the late afternoon, always with some official reason ready if anyone questioned him, though the reasons grew thinner each time. Mira noticed, of course. Mira noticed everything. "The Alpha King has visited this station 4 times, in 2 weeks, she said one afternoon, watching Elena restock a shelf of dried herbs with far more concentration than the task required. "In 3 years, I don't believe he's set foot here more than twice. He's had guards with injuries, Elena said, not looking up. Mira's tone made it clear she believed nothing of the sort. And does he usually stay to speak with you for 20 minutes after the treatment is finished? Elena's hands stilled on the shelf. She hadn't realized anyone had been counting the minutes, hadn't realized the growing pattern of Cale's visits had been so obvious to anyone paying attention. She turned to face Mira, unsure how to explain something she barely understood herself. I don't know what's happening, she admitted quietly. I don't have an explanation that makes sense. Mira studied her for a long moment, her expression softening from suspicion into something gentler, something almost worried. Elena. I've watched you work for 3 years. You're careful, sensible. You don't take risks you can't afford. But this, whatever this is with the Alpha King, this is not a small risk. There are people in this fortress who have built their entire futures around him, choosing a Luna from among the noble families. If they believe you're standing in the way of that, they won't be gentle about removing you from it. The warning settled uncomfortably in Elena's chest, because she knew Mira was right, and because some quiet, worried part of her had already begun to fear the same thing. She had seen Lady Seraphine at a distance a handful of times since the reception, always dressed in elegant, expensive fabrics, always surrounded by a small circle of noblewomen who watched Elena pass, with expressions ranging from curiosity to open disdain. She hadn't thought much of it at the time. Now, she wondered. I'll be careful, Elena said, though she wasn't entirely certain what being careful would look like, when the source of the danger was a connection she couldn't seem to stop herself from wanting. That evening, Cale found her again, this time waiting near the edge of the fortress gardens, as the sun began to set, a place far enough from the main halls that neither of them worried about curious eyes. He had sent word earlier in the day, a simple note asking if she might walk with him after her shift ended, and Elena had spent the entire afternoon deciding whether to accept, before finally admitting to herself that she had never truly considered refusing. You look troubled, Cale said as she approached, studying her face with the same careful attention he always gave her, as though nothing about her was unimportant enough to overlook. Mira noticed your visits, Elena admitted. She warned me to be careful. Something in his expression tightened, though he didn't look surprised. She's not wrong to warn you. You've heard the whispers too. I hear everything that happens in this fortress, whether I want to or not. He gestured toward a stone bench beneath a wide, flowering tree, and they sat together, close enough that Elena could feel the warmth of him beside her, though neither of them touched. Lady Seraphine's family has invested a great deal in the expectation that she'll become Luna. The council elders support the match. It would strengthen an alliance with the Eastern Territories that we've needed for years. And what do you want? Elena asked quietly. Cale turned to look at her, and the intensity in his gray eyes made her breath catch the same way it had the very first moment they'd met. I want to understand what's happening between us. Before I make any decision that affects either of our lives permanently, I want to know if this is real, or if I'm allowing myself to be swept up in something my instincts are inventing out of loneliness. Do you believe it's real? Every day, more than the day before. The honesty in his voice settled something in Elena's chest, even as fear continued to whisper at the edges of her mind. Fear of what it would mean if this connection between them grew into something the entire fortress could see. Fear of what Lady Seraphine and her powerful allies might do if they felt threatened by a healer's assistant standing in their way. There's an old healer, Elena said slowly, thinking of a woman named Old Greta who had trained alongside her mother decades earlier, and now spent her days tending the fortress's medicinal gardens. Her knowledge of pack traditions, deeper than anyone else Elena had ever met. She might understand what's happening to us better than either of us do. She's studied the old bonds, the old stories, longer than I've been alive. Cale considered this for a moment before nodding. Then let's ask her. They found Old Greta the following afternoon, kneeling among rows of healing herbs in the fortress gardens, her weathered hands moving with practiced ease as she pulled weeds from between delicate green stems. She looked up as they approached, and something in her expression shifted immediately, her sharp eyes moving between Elena and Cale, with a recognition that made Elena's stomach tighten with nerves. I wondered when you'd come to me, Old Greta said, rising slowly to her feet, brushing soil from her hands. The whole garden has been buzzing about it for days. Even the herbs seem to know something's changed. You know why we're here, Cale said. I have a fair guess. Old Greta studied them both for a long moment, her gaze lingering on the small, unconscious distance they kept maintaining between their hands, as though both of them were fighting the urge to close it. "Tell me what happened. Every detail. Leave nothing out." Elena described the fall in the hallway, the strange warmth that had spread through her chest the moment Cale's arms closed around her, the sleepless nights that followed, the way she couldn't stop thinking about storm-gray eyes, no matter how hard she tried. Cale added his own account, the recognition he'd felt, the pull that had drawn him back to the healer's quarters again and again despite every reasonable argument telling him to stay away. Old Greta listened without interrupting, and when they finished, she was quiet for a long moment, her expression thoughtful. "There are old stories," she said finally, "passed down through generations of healers and pack leaders both, about a connection that forms not through choice or courtship, but through recognition. Two souls meeting for the first time, and knowing, instantly, that they belong to each other. The old texts call it a bond mark, though it has no visible mark at all, only the undeniable pull between two people who have found what they were always meant to find. You believe that's what happened to us," Elena said quietly. "I believe it's rare enough that most people live their entire lives without experiencing it," old Greta said. "And I believe, from what you've both described, that it's exactly what's happening between the two of you. The instant recognition, the pull that only grows stronger the more time you spend together. The way neither of you can seem to stop thinking about the other, no matter how inconvenient the timing." She looked between them with something like sympathy. "It's a gift, in the old stories, but it's rarely simple. The heart doesn't ask permission from politics or family alliances, or council expectations. It simply chooses." Cale's jaw tightened, and Elena could see him already thinking through the implications, the resistance he would face from his council, the alliance with the Eastern Territories that would collapse if he didn't marry Lady Seraphine as everyone expected. "What happens," Elena asked carefully, "if two people with this bond try to ignore it? If they decide it's too complicated, too dangerous, to pursue?" Old Greta's expression grew serious. "The old stories aren't kind about that choice. A bond denied doesn't simply fade away. It lingers, unresolved, and it causes a particular kind of suffering that only worsens with time. I've seen it happen twice in my life. Neither ending was gentle." The warning hung heavy in the garden air, and Elena felt Cale's hand find hers, gentle and hesitant, as though he were asking permission, even through the simple gesture. She didn't pull away. She let her fingers curl around his, and the warmth that spread through her chest at the contact confirmed everything old Greta had just told them, everything Elena had been too frightened to fully believe until this moment. "Thank you," Cale said quietly to the old healer, "for your honesty." "Thank me by being careful with each other," old Greta said, her sharp eyes softening. "And by being careful of the people who won't want this to be true, because there will be many of them, and not all of them will fight fairly." Elena thought of Lady Seraphine's cold, calculating expression from the hallway weeks earlier, and a chill settled over her despite the warm afternoon sun. She didn't yet understand how dangerous that resistance would become, how far Seraphine would be willing to go to protect the future she had built for herself. But some quiet, instinctive part of her already sensed that the peaceful weeks she and Cale had shared so far were only the beginning of a much harder fight. They left the garden together, walking slowly, unwilling to release each other's hands, even as the fortress walls rose around them once more, pulling them back into a world of politics and expectations that had no place for something as simple and undeniable as two hearts recognizing each other in a crowded hallway. Neither of them noticed the servant girl who had been sent, quietly and deliberately, to watch the garden that afternoon, nor did they notice her hurrying back toward the noble quarters the moment they left, eager to deliver everything she had witnessed to the woman who had paid her handsomely for exactly this kind of information. Lady Seraphine listened to the servant's report in silence, her expression unreadable, her fingers tapping slowly against the arm of her chair. When the girl finished speaking, Seraphine dismissed her with a single cold nod and sat alone in her chambers for a long time, staring out at the darkening sky, her mind already turning through the possibilities of what she intended to do next. A bond mark. Old stories and superstition, nothing more, as far as she was concerned. But it didn't matter whether she believed in it. It only mattered that Cale appeared to believe in it, and that belief, left unchecked, threatened to unravel everything Seraphine had spent years building. She would not allow that. Whatever it took, She would not allow a healer's assistant to steal the future that belonged to her. The first sign of trouble arrived 3 days later, in the form of a rumor that spread through the healer's quarters faster than any illness ever could. Elena heard it first from one of the younger assistants, a nervous girl named Willa who approached her during the midday meal with wide, uncertain eyes. "There's a story going around the kitchens," Willa said, keeping her voice low. "About you. About supplies going missing from the eastern storeroom, and someone saying they saw you near there late at night." Elena set down her spoon, her appetite gone. "I've never been near the eastern storeroom. I don't even have a key to it." "I believe you," Willa said quickly, "but the story's spreading anyway. Someone said you've been selling healing herbs to outside traders for extra coin." The accusation was so absurd, so completely unfounded, that Elena's first instinct was disbelief. She had never stolen anything in her life, had never even considered it, had built her entire reputation among the healers on careful, honest work. And yet by that evening, the rumor had grown teeth, whispered in corners throughout the fortress, twisted further with each retelling, until it included details Elena couldn't have invented if she'd tried. Mira confronted her about it directly, her expression tight with concern rather than accusation. "I know it isn't true," Mira said, "but the head steward has heard the story now, and he's asked questions. This isn't a small rumor anymore, Elena. Someone is working very hard to make sure it spreads." Elena didn't need to ask who. She thought of Lady Seraphine's cold eyes from across the crowded hallway weeks earlier, and a heavy, sinking dread settled in her stomach. She told Cale that evening, finding him in the private council wing after her shift ended, and watched his expression darken as she described the rumor and the speed with which it had spread. "This isn't coincidence," he said, his jaw tight with barely controlled anger. "Rumors like this don't build themselves overnight, without deliberate effort. You think Lady Seraphine is behind it. I know she is." Cale ran a hand through his hair, pacing the length of his study with restless energy. "I should have anticipated this. I've been careless, visiting the healer's quarters, without considering how it would look to those watching for exactly this kind of opportunity." "It isn't your fault," Elena said, though the words did little to ease the growing anxiety in her chest. "But what do we do now? If the head steward believes the rumors, I could lose my position. I could be sent away from the fortress entirely." "That won't happen." Cale's voice hardened with certainty. "I'll speak with the head steward myself. I'll make it clear the accusations are false." "And what happens when everyone realizes why the Alpha King is personally defending a healer's assistant against rumors of theft?" Elena asked quietly. "Won't that only confirm exactly what Lady Seraphine wants people to suspect?" Cale stopped pacing, his shoulders tense, and Elena could see him working through the impossible position they'd found themselves in. Any action he took to protect her risked exposing the connection between them, before either of them fully understood what it meant, or how to explain it to a fortress full of people who expected him to marry for strategy rather than feeling. "I won't let you be punished for something you didn't do," he said finally, "whatever the cost." The following days brought no relief. The rumors continued to spread, shifting and growing with each retelling, and Elena found herself the subject of suspicious glances from healers she had worked alongside for years, people who had never once questioned her honesty, before Lady Seraphine's influence began working through the fortress like poison through water. Worse still, small, deliberate obstacles began appearing in Elena's daily work. Supplies she needed for treatments would go missing just before she reached for them, only to reappear hours later, in places she hadn't left them. Patients scheduled for her care were quietly reassigned to other healers without explanation. Her requests for basic materials, requests that had always been approved without question, suddenly required additional signatures and unnecessary delays. It was subtle enough that no single incident could be proven as deliberate sabotage, but the pattern was unmistakable to anyone paying close attention, and Elena understood exactly what was happening, even as she struggled to prove it. "She's trying to push me out," Elena told Cale one evening, exhaustion evident in her voice, after another day of small, frustrating obstacles. "Not through anything dramatic enough to draw attention, just enough to make my position here unbearable." "I want to intervene directly," Cale said, his frustration barely contained. "I want to confront her, expose what she's doing, put an end to this before it goes any further." "If you do that, everyone will know why," Elena said. And I don't know if I'm ready for the entire fortress to know what's happening between us. Not when I don't fully understand it myself. Cale's expression softened, and he reached for her hand, threading his fingers through hers, with a gentleness that eased some of the tension in her chest, despite everything happening around them. I understand your hesitation, but I won't watch you suffer in silence while she works to destroy your reputation. There has to be another way to handle this. They sat together in comfortable silence for a while, both of them turning over possibilities, until Elena finally spoke again, her voice quiet but determined. Let me handle the daily obstacles myself, for now, she said. I'm not without resources. Mira supports me, and old Greta has offered to help however she can. If the situation grows worse, if it becomes something I truly cannot manage alone, then I'll ask for your help. But I don't want to hide behind you every time something difficult happens. I want to prove, on my own, that the rumors are false. Cale studied her for a long moment, something like admiration mixing with his obvious worry. You're stronger than most people I've met, in positions of far greater power than yours. I've had to be, Elena said simply. Over the following week, Elena did exactly as she'd promised, meeting each small obstacle with quiet determination rather than panic. She documented every missing supply, every reassigned patient, every unnecessary delay, building a careful record that Mira helped her maintain, a record that would prove useful if the situation ever escalated into something requiring formal intervention. She also found unexpected allies. Old Greta, who commanded deep respect among the fortress's healers despite her advanced age, began speaking openly in Elena's defense whenever the rumors surfaced in conversation, her decades of credibility carrying weight that Elena's own words alone could not match. Willa, the nervous young assistant who had first warned Elena about the rumor, became a quiet source of information, alerting Elena to new whispers before they could cause serious damage. Slowly, carefully, the tide began to shift. The rumors didn't disappear entirely, but they lost some of their momentum, weakened by Elena's continued excellent work and the growing number of people willing to vouch for her character, despite the whispers circulating against her. Lady Seraphine noticed the shift, of course, and her frustration grew correspondingly sharper. She confronted Elena directly for the first time nearly 2 weeks after the rumors began, catching her alone in a quiet corridor near the healer's quarters, as evening settled over the fortress. Seraphine's expression carried none of the polished elegance she wore in public, replaced instead by something colder, more calculating. You've made yourself quite difficult to remove, Seraphine said without preamble, her voice low and sharp. I have to admire the effort, even if it's ultimately pointless. I haven't done anything wrong, Elena said, keeping her voice steady despite the fear tightening in her chest. I don't understand why you've decided to make me your enemy. Don't pretend to be naive, it doesn't suit you. Seraphine's eyes narrowed. You've caught the Alpha King's attention through some strange twist of fate, and now you believe that gives you the right to interfere with alliances that have taken years to build. The Eastern Territories expect this marriage. My family has staked our entire future on it. And you, a healer's assistant with no name, no family standing, no understanding of what's truly at stake, believe you can simply walk into that future and dismantle it. I never asked for any of this, Elena said quietly. I didn't choose to fall into his arms that day. I didn't choose whatever this connection is between us. It doesn't matter whether you chose it. Seraphine's voice hardened further. What matters is whether you're willing to walk away from it before it destroys everything around you. Because I promise you, Elena Voss, I will not stop until you're gone from this fortress, one way or another. The only question is how difficult you intend to make that process for both of us. She turned and walked away before Elena could respond, leaving her standing alone in the corridor, shaken, but also, unexpectedly, more resolved than she had been in weeks. The threat should have frightened her into retreat. Instead, it clarified something Elena had been struggling to fully accept until that moment. Whatever this connection with Cale truly was, whatever complications and dangers it brought with it, she wasn't willing to walk away from it simply because someone with more power and privilege believed she had no right to want it. She found Cale later that night and told him everything Seraphine had said, watching his expression shift from concern into something harder, more resolute. She threatened you directly, he said, his voice tight with barely controlled fury. That changes things. I'm not afraid of her, Elena said, though her voice trembled slightly as she said it. I know you're not. Cale pulled her gently into his arms, and Elena let herself lean into the warmth and steadiness of him, the same warmth that had first pulled her in weeks earlier in that crowded hallway. But I am afraid for you, and I won't let her continue threatening you while I stand by and do nothing. Cale was quiet for a long moment, his jaw set with the particular determination Elena had come to recognize as the expression he wore when making decisions that would not be easily undone. I'm going to make certain everyone in this fortress understands exactly where I stand, he said finally. Whatever the political cost. He didn't act immediately. Instead, over the following days, Cale began attending the healer's station more openly, no longer inventing excuses about shoulder pain or headaches, no longer disguising his visits as anything other than what they were. He asked after Elena directly in front of other healers, walked beside her through the fortress corridors without concern for who might see, and made no effort to hide the warmth in his expression whenever she was near. The change did not go unnoticed. Whispers that had once centered on rumors of stolen supplies shifted instead toward speculation about the Alpha King's growing, undisguised affection for a healer's assistant, and though some of the whispers remained unkind, many others turned curious, even sympathetic, especially among the fortress's working staff, who had watched Elena's quiet dedication for years, and found something almost hopeful in the idea that their Alpha might choose someone genuine over someone merely strategic. Lady Seraphine's response to this shift was immediate and severe. She requested a formal audience with the council elders, a group of senior advisors who held significant influence over matters of pack alliance and succession, and used the audience to raise formal concerns about the Alpha King's judgment, suggesting that his attention toward an unremarkable healer's assistant reflected instability unbecoming of someone in his position, instability that threatened the stability of alliances the entire Northern Territories depended upon. Cale was informed of the audience only after it had already taken place, summoned before the council elders the following morning, to answer for concerns he hadn't known were being raised. The council chamber felt colder than usual, as Cale took his seat at the head of the long table, facing a row of stern, weathered faces that had watched over pack leadership for decades. Elder Thorn, the eldest and most respected among them, spoke first, his voice carrying the particular gravity of someone accustomed to being heeded without question. Concerns have been raised, Alpha Ashford, regarding your recent conduct, Elder Thorn said. Specifically, regarding your relationship with a healer's assistant of no notable family standing, and the impact this relationship may have on the Eastern Alliance we have spent years cultivating. I'm aware of the concerns, Cale said evenly. I assume Lady Seraphine raised them. The source of the concern is less important than its validity, another elder interjected, a sharp-faced woman named Councilwoman Merrick. Your father built this territory's strength through careful alliance and calculated leadership. We expect the same wisdom from you. Cale's jaw tightened, but his voice remained calm and steady. My father also taught me that leadership built entirely on calculation, without regard for genuine conviction, eventually collapses under its own weight. I have not made any formal declaration regarding marriage or succession. I have simply spent time with someone whose company I value. A healer's assistant, Elder Thorn repeated, his tone carrying clear skepticism. With respect, Alpha Ashford, the Northern Territories require a Luna capable of managing alliances, commanding respect among noble families, and understanding the delicate political landscape that keeps our borders secure. Affection alone does not qualify someone for such responsibilities. And yet, Cale said, his voice hardening slightly, affection alone has been entirely absent from every match this council has presented to me over the past 2 years. I've met every candidate you've proposed with patience and consideration, and I've felt nothing that resembles genuine connection with any of them. I will not be pressured into a marriage built solely on strategic convenience, simply because it satisfies this council's preferences. The chamber fell silent, several of the elders exchanging uneasy glances, unaccustomed to such direct resistance from an alpha who had, until recently, deferred to their guidance with far greater consistency. Are you suggesting, Councilwoman Merrick said slowly, that you intend to pursue this connection with Elena Voss, despite the concerns this council has raised? Cale met her gaze without hesitation. I'm suggesting that I intend to make my own decisions regarding my future, informed by this council's counsel, but not dictated entirely by it. I respect the work this council does for our territories. But I will not sacrifice my own judgment on a matter as important as who I choose to build a future with. The meeting ended without resolution, the elders retreating to discuss the matter further among themselves, though the tension in the chamber made clear that Cale's defiance had not been well received. Word of the confrontation spread through the fortress within hours, reaching Elena before Cale had the chance to tell her himself. She found him afterward in his private study, his expression tired but resolute, and she crossed the room to sit beside him without needing to ask what had happened. "You defended me in front of the entire council," she said quietly. "I told them the truth," Cale said, "that I won't be pressured into a decision that doesn't reflect what I genuinely want." "They won't let this go easily," Elena said, worry evident in her voice. "Especially not Lady Seraphine." "I know." Cale reached for her hand, holding it gently between both of his own. "But I'd rather face their resistance honestly than continue hiding something I no longer wish to hide." Their relationship, once carefully guarded from public attention, now existed in the open, discussed and debated throughout every level of the fortress, from the noble quarters down to the kitchens and healer's station. Some embraced the change with genuine warmth, delighted by the idea of a romance built on connection rather than calculation. Others, particularly those with interests tied to the Eastern Alliance Lady Seraphine's family represented, viewed the development with open hostility. Elena found herself navigating this new, more visible reality with a mixture of relief and continued anxiety. Relief, because the exhausting secrecy that had defined the early weeks of their connection had finally lifted, allowing her to spend time with Cale without the constant fear of discovery. Anxiety, because visibility brought new dangers, new scrutiny, new opportunities for those who wished to see the connection fail. The greatest test of this new reality arrived less than 2 weeks later, when reports reached the fortress of a coordinated raid along the eastern border, a small but violent incursion by scouts from a rival territory, testing the strength of the northern defenses during what they perceived as a moment of internal division. Cale left immediately with a contingent of his personal guard to assess the damage and reinforce the border defenses, and Elena spent 3 agonizing days at the fortress with little news, her mind consumed with worry despite her efforts to focus on her ongoing duties at the healer's station. When word finally arrived that the border had been secured and Cale's party was returning, relief flooded through Elena so completely that she nearly wept in the middle of the healer's station, earning a knowing, sympathetic look from Mira that required no explanation. But the relief was short-lived. The returning guard brought with them several wounded soldiers, injuries sustained during the skirmish at the border, and Elena threw herself immediately into treating them alongside the other healers, grateful for the distraction of purposeful work after days of helpless waiting. It was during this chaos, hours into treating the wounded, that she heard Cale's voice, calling for her specifically, an edge of urgency in his tone that sent ice through her veins even before she turned to see him. He was carrying a young guard in his arms, a boy who couldn't have been more than 18, blood soaking through a hastily applied bandage at his side, his face pale and drawn with pain. He was injured, protecting the eastern gate, Cale said, his voice tight with barely controlled panic that Elena had never heard from him before. The wound won't stop bleeding. Elena immediately took charge, directing Cale to lay the young guard on the nearest empty cot, her training taking over as she assessed the wound with practiced, steady hands despite the racing of her own heart. The injury was serious, a deep cut that had narrowly missed anything vital, but had bled heavily enough to leave the boy weak and disoriented. "I need clean bandages, and the tincture from the third shelf, quickly," she said, and Mira moved immediately to retrieve what she needed, while Elena applied pressure to the wound, speaking softly and steadily to the frightened young guard, calming him, even as she worked to stop the bleeding. Cale stood beside her throughout the entire process, close enough that Elena could feel the tension radiating from him, his concern for the young guard mixing visibly with something else, something that looked, when Elena finally glanced up at him, remarkably like fear for her own safety, as though the sight of blood and injury had reminded him sharply of how fragile the people he cared about truly were. It took nearly an hour of careful work, but Elena eventually stopped the bleeding and stabilized the young guard, whose color slowly began returning as the immediate danger passed. She sat back finally, exhausted, her hands trembling slightly from the sustained concentration, and Cale was there immediately, kneeling beside her, his hand finding hers. "You saved his life," he said quietly. "I did my job," Elena said, though the praise still warmed something in her chest despite her exhaustion. "You did far more than your job." Cale's gray eyes studied her with an intensity that made the exhaustion in her body feel suddenly less important. "I've spent the last 3 days terrified of losing soldiers under my command. I never once considered how terrified I would feel, watching you work to save one of them, knowing how easily something could have gone wrong." "Nothing went wrong," Elena said gently. "He'll recover." "This time," Cale said quietly. "But it reminded me of something I've been avoiding thinking about too closely. The world we live in is dangerous, Elena. Border skirmishes, rival territories, political enemies, who wouldn't hesitate to use violence if it served their purposes. If I bring you fully into my life, fully into my world, I bring you into that danger as well." Elena reached for his hand, holding it firmly despite her exhaustion. "I've already chosen to be part of your world, Cale, danger included. I'm not asking you to protect me from every possible risk. I'm asking you to let me stand beside you regardless of what comes." He studied her for a long moment, something shifting behind his eyes, some final piece of resistance finally settling into acceptance. He lifted her hand to his lips, pressing a gentle kiss against her knuckles, a gesture so tender and unexpected that Elena felt her breath catch entirely. "Then stand beside me," he said quietly, "for however long fate allows it." Around them, the healer's station slowly settled back into calm as the last of the wounded were treated and stabilized, and neither of them noticed, in that quiet, exhausted moment, that their growing bond had just survived its first true test of danger. Nor did they yet know how many more tests still waited ahead, each one more difficult than the last. In the weeks that followed the border skirmish, Elena found herself returning again and again to old Greta's garden, drawn not only by friendship but by a growing hunger to understand exactly what this bond between her and Cale truly meant, and what responsibilities, if any, it carried beyond the simple pull that had brought them together. "You want to know if it's permanent," old Greta said one afternoon, watching Elena's hands move absently through a row of drying lavender without actually gathering any of it. "Whether it can be broken, or whether it binds you both regardless of choice." "I want to understand what I'm agreeing to," Elena admitted. "Cale has responsibilities that reach far beyond just the two of us. If I'm going to stand beside him through all of that, I want to understand exactly what I'm stepping into." Old Greta settled onto the low garden bench, gesturing for Elena to join her, and spoke slowly, choosing her words with the particular care of someone passing down knowledge she considered sacred. "The old bond isn't a chain," she said. "It doesn't force either of you into anything against your will. What it does is recognize compatibility so complete, so rare, that few people ever experience it in their lifetimes. It strengthens with time and honesty between the two people who share it. It weakens, and can cause genuine suffering, when either person tries to deny or ignore it. But it has never, in any story I've studied, forced someone into a future they didn't ultimately choose for themselves. So we could still choose to walk away from each other." "You could." Old Greta's expression grew serious. "But I don't believe either of you wants to. And I don't believe, watching the two of you together these past weeks, that walking away is truly a choice your hearts would allow you to make peacefully, even if your minds convinced you it was wise." Elena thought of the warmth that filled her chest every time she saw Cale, the way the fortress felt brighter and more bearable, simply knowing he was somewhere within its walls, the quiet, steady comfort of his presence that had become, in a remarkably short time, essential to her sense of home. Old Greta was right. Walking away, even if circumstances demanded it, would not be a wound that healed easily. "There's something else," old Greta continued, her voice dropping slightly. "Something you should understand about bonds this strong, particularly for someone in Cale's position. When an alpha finds a true bond and publicly acknowledges it, the strength of that bond becomes something more than personal. It becomes visible to those attuned to pack instincts, a kind of confirmation that ripples outward through the territory. Other alphas, other packs, will sense it eventually, whether either of you intends for them to or not. What does that mean, practically? It means the bond you share isn't only a private matter between the two of you," old Greta said. It becomes, in a sense, a statement about the strength and stability of Kale's leadership. A genuine bond, properly acknowledged, can strengthen a pack's confidence in its alpha. It can also, if handled poorly or denied out of fear, create instability that rival territories might attempt to exploit. The weight of this new understanding settled heavily over Elena as she walked back toward the healer's quarters that evening, turning the implications over in her mind again and again. She had thought, foolishly perhaps, that the greatest obstacles facing her and Kale were political ones, Lady Seraphine's schemes and the council's expectations regarding strategic marriage. She hadn't fully considered that the bond itself carried consequences reaching far beyond their personal relationship, consequences that touched the stability of the entire Northern Territories. She shared this new understanding with Kale that evening, watching his expression grow thoughtful as she relayed old Greta's words. "She's right," he said finally. "I've felt it myself, though I hadn't put words to it until now. The other alphas who attended the reception weeks ago, when you first fell into my arms, several of them approached me afterward with questions I didn't fully understand at the time. Questions about my plans for succession, about whether recent events suggested a change in my priorities. I dismissed it as ordinary political curiosity. I wonder now if some of them sensed something more. Does that frighten you?" Elena asked. Kale considered the question seriously before answering. "It concerns me, in the sense that I want to handle this correctly, for both our sakes, and for the sake of the territories I'm responsible for. But it doesn't frighten me in the way it once might have. I've spent years making decisions based purely on strategic calculation, and those decisions kept our territories stable, but they never once made me feel the way these past weeks with you have made me feel. I'm no longer willing to sacrifice that feeling, simply because it complicates the political landscape." His certainty steadied something in Elena's chest, though the underlying anxiety remained, a persistent awareness that their growing bond existed within a much larger, more complicated world than the quiet corners of the garden, or the private study where they'd shared their earliest conversations. That awareness sharpened considerably 3 days later, when a formal delegation arrived from the Eastern Territories, sent by Lady Seraphine's family, to discuss the details of the alliance her father had been negotiating for over a year, an alliance that had always assumed Seraphine's eventual marriage to Kale as its foundation. The delegation's arrival threw the fortress into a flurry of formal preparation, and Kale found himself pulled into hours of tense negotiation, forced to navigate the delicate diplomatic reality of an alliance his family had relied upon for generations, while making clear, without directly insulting his guests, that the marriage foundation for that alliance no longer reflected his intentions. Elena watched from a careful distance, understanding that her presence during these formal negotiations would only complicate matters further, though the waiting proved its own particular kind of difficult. She occupied herself with her usual duties at the healer's station, trying not to imagine the tense conversations happening within the fortress's formal meeting chambers, trying not to worry about what consequences might follow if the Eastern delegation reacted poorly to the news that their long-planned alliance now stood on uncertain ground. Kale found her late that evening, exhaustion evident in every line of his posture as he settled onto the garden bench beside her, the same bench where they had first spoken with old Greta weeks earlier. "How did it go?" Elena asked carefully. "Difficult," Kale admitted. "The Eastern delegation isn't pleased. They've invested significant resources in the expectation of this alliance, and they made it clear that withdrawing the marriage foundation could jeopardize trade agreements that both our territories depend upon." Elena's stomach tightened with worry. "What did you tell them?" "I told them the truth, that I have no intention of marrying Lady Seraphine, regardless of the political convenience it might offer. I also told them I remain committed to preserving the trade alliance between our territories through other means, formal agreements, that don't depend on marriage as their foundation." "Did they accept that?" Reluctantly. Kale rubbed a hand across his tired eyes. "They've requested additional time to consider new terms. I suspect Lady Seraphine's father is furious, and I suspect Seraphine herself is even more furious, given how much of her personal future depended on this arrangement succeeding." Elena reached for his hand, offering what comfort she could through the simple gesture. "I'm sorry this has become so complicated because of me." "Don't apologize for this," Kale said firmly, turning to face her fully. "I've spent years accepting political complications as simply the cost of leadership. But I refuse to accept the idea that choosing genuine happiness, choosing you, is something I should apologize for. If anything, these past weeks have taught me that I let political convenience guide too many decisions for far too long. His words settled warmly in Elena's chest, but the underlying tension remained, a persistent awareness that Lady Seraphine, having lost significant ground in her carefully constructed future, would not simply retreat quietly. If anything, Elena suspected, the coming weeks would only bring sharper, more desperate resistance from a woman who had just watched years of careful planning begin to unravel entirely. She was right to suspect it. What she couldn't have anticipated was exactly how far Lady Seraphine intended to go to reverse the damage, nor how quickly the fragile peace they'd built together would be tested once again. Lady Seraphine's family departed the fortress a week later. Their formal alliance discussions concluded with vague, unsatisfying promises of renewed negotiation at a future date. But Seraphine herself remained behind, insisting to her father that she required additional time at the fortress to manage what she called lingering diplomatic obligations. Her father, distracted by the greater concerns of trade agreements and border stability, agreed without questioning her true motivations. Elena learned of Seraphine's continued presence through Willa, who had become an increasingly reliable source of quiet information from within the fortress's staff network, the kind of information nobles rarely realized their servants overheard and shared among themselves. "She's meeting privately with Councilwoman Merrick," Willa reported one afternoon, her voice hushed despite the empty corridor around them. "2 evenings this week already. The maid who serves refreshments during their meetings said they've been discussing something about ancient succession laws." Elena's stomach tightened with unease. Succession laws? "That's all she overheard before she was sent away," Willa said, but it didn't sound like a friendly conversation. Elena relayed this information to Cale that evening, watching his expression shift from mild concern into something sharper, more focused, the particular alertness he wore when facing a genuine political threat rather than simple court gossip. "Ancient succession laws," he repeated slowly. "There are old provisions, rarely invoked, that allow the council to challenge an alpha's chosen successor or mate if they can demonstrate the choice threatens the territory's stability. They haven't been used in generations, not since long before my father's time, but they still exist within our formal governing texts." "Could they actually use something like that against us?" Elena asked, fear tightening her voice. "It would be difficult," Cale said, though his tone lacked complete confidence. "The provision requires substantial evidence of genuine threat to the territory, not simply political inconvenience. But if Seraphine and Councilwoman Merrick are researching it seriously enough to meet privately about it, they likely believe they can construct an argument that satisfies that requirement." The following days brought increasing evidence that Cale's concerns were justified. Formal inquiries began circulating through the fortress archives, requests for historical records regarding past instances of alphas choosing mates outside noble bloodlines, records regarding the outcomes of those unions, and whether any had resulted in political instability that justified the council's continued caution regarding matters of succession. Cale confronted Councilwoman Merrick directly, requesting a private audience to address the rumors of her continued alliance with Lady Seraphine's efforts to challenge his personal choices. "I won't deny my concerns," Merrick told him plainly, her sharp features betraying no guilt despite the confrontation. "I've served this council for over 20 years, Alpha Ashford, and I've watched what happens when alphas allow personal feeling to override strategic necessity. History has not been kind to those decisions. Elena is not a strategic liability," Cale said firmly. "She's shown nothing but dedication and integrity since the day I met her." "Perhaps," Merrick said, "but integrity alone does not secure borders or maintain trade alliances that feed and protect thousands of people across our territories. I'm not motivated by cruelty toward Miss Voss, Alpha Ashford. I'm motivated by decades of experience watching what happens when leadership prioritizes personal desire over collective responsibility." The conversation ended without resolution, and Cale returned to Elena that evening carrying the weight of a battle that had grown far more complicated than either of them had initially anticipated. What had begun as Lady Seraphine's personal jealousy had evolved into something with genuine institutional backing, a threat that could not simply be dismissed as one woman's desperate scheming. "They're serious about this," Cale admitted, pacing the length of his study, with barely contained frustration. "If they gather enough support among the council elders, They could formally challenge my judgment regarding succession. It wouldn't remove me from leadership entirely, but it could force restrictions on decisions regarding marriage and inheritance that I would otherwise be free to make on my own. What can we do? Elena asked, trying to keep the fear from her voice, despite how thoroughly it had settled into her chest. We need allies, Cale said. Council members who support genuine leadership over rigid strategic tradition. And we need evidence that our bond, whatever challenges it might create politically, ultimately strengthens, rather than threatens this territory's stability. They spent the following days building exactly that case, meeting quietly with council members whose loyalty to Cale ran deeper than their loyalty to old tradition, gathering testimonials from Fortress staff who had witnessed Elena's genuine character and dedication over her years of service, documenting the strength and stability that had actually resulted from Cale's more open, honest leadership since he had stopped hiding his connection to her. Old Greta proved an unexpectedly powerful ally in this effort, her decades of respected service lending significant weight to her willingness to speak formally before the council regarding the ancient bond traditions and their historical significance within pack culture, reminding the elders that dismissing such bonds as mere sentiment ignored centuries of tradition that predated even the strategic marriage customs Councilwoman Merrick championed so strongly. Despite these efforts, the tension within the fortress continued building toward something that felt, to Elena, increasingly like an inevitable confrontation. She found herself sleeping poorly, her mind circling endlessly through worst-case scenarios, imagining formal hearings and public challenges that could strip away everything she and Cale had built together over the past weeks. The confrontation, when it finally arrived, came not through formal council proceedings, but through a far more direct and personal attack. Elena was walking alone through a quiet corridor near the fortress's eastern wing, returning from a late evening errand to the medicine storage rooms, when Lady Seraphine appeared suddenly from a side passage, blocking her path with an expression that had abandoned all pretense of polished nobility. "You should have left when I gave you the chance," Seraphine said, her voice sharp with barely controlled fury. "Instead, you've made a fool of me in front of my own father, cost my family a critical alliance, and turned the entire fortress into a spectacle over some foolish superstition about bonds and fate." "I never intended any of that," Elena said, keeping her voice as steady as possible, despite the fear tightening in her chest. "Intentions don't matter," Seraphine snapped. "Consequences matter. And you will face consequences for what you've cost me, Elena Voss, whether Cale Ashford stands beside you or not." Before Elena could respond, Seraphine reached into the folds of her elegant dress and withdrew a small, sealed letter, holding it up with a cold, satisfied smile. "This letter contains testimony from 3 separate witnesses, all willing to swear before the council that you used improper influence and manipulation to secure the Alpha King's attention, exploiting his recent grief and political isolation for personal gain. It will be presented to the full council tomorrow morning." "That's a lie," Elena said, horror rising through her chest. "I've never manipulated Cale. Everyone who knows us both understands that. The council doesn't need truth, Elena. They need sufficient doubt to justify formal action, and this letter will provide exactly that." Seraphine's smile widened, cold and triumphant. "By tomorrow evening, you'll be facing formal charges of manipulation and undue influence over a Pack Alpha, charges that carry serious consequences, including permanent removal from the fortress and any territory under Cale Ashford's protection." Panic flooded through Elena, but beneath the fear, something steadier began to rise, a resolve that hardened as she looked directly into Seraphine's cold, calculating eyes. "You can present whatever false testimony you'd like," Elena said, her voice gaining strength despite her racing heart. "But I've done nothing wrong, and I refuse to disappear quietly, simply because you're desperate to reclaim a future that was never truly guaranteed to you in the first place." Seraphine's expression flickered with something like surprise at Elena's unexpected defiance, quickly replaced by renewed coldness. "We'll see how much resolve remains once you're standing before the full council tomorrow morning, facing accusations that could end everything you've built here." She swept past Elena, without another word, disappearing down the corridor, leaving Elena standing alone in the dim evening light, her hands trembling despite her outward composure. She found Cale immediately, relaying everything Seraphine had said, watching his expression shift from shock into something far more dangerous, a controlled, focused anger that Elena had never seen from him before. "She won't get away with this," Cale said, his voice low and absolutely certain. "Whatever false testimony she's constructed, I'll ensure the truth is heard clearly before that council tomorrow, regardless of what it costs politically. Cale, if this goes to formal proceedings, it won't destroy us," he said firmly, pulling her gently into his arms, holding her with a steadiness that helped calm the panic still racing through her chest. "I promise you, Elena, whatever tomorrow brings, we'll face it together, and we'll face it with truth on our side. That has to be enough." Elena wanted desperately to believe him, wanted to trust that truth and integrity would ultimately triumph over fabricated testimony and political desperation. But as she lay awake that night, unable to sleep despite her exhaustion, she couldn't shake the growing fear that tomorrow's confrontation would determine far more than simply her own future within the fortress. It would determine whether the bond she and Cale shared could truly withstand the full weight of political ambition determined to destroy it. The council chamber was full the following morning, far fuller than Elena had expected, word of the formal proceedings having spread through the fortress overnight, until it seemed every noble family and senior staff member had found some reason to attend. Elena stood near the center of the room, flanked by Mira and old Greta, both of whom had insisted on standing beside her despite the risk to their own standing within the fortress hierarchy. Cale sat at the head of the council table, his expression composed but his eyes carrying a controlled intensity that Elena recognized as barely restrained anger, waiting for Lady Seraphine to present the formal accusations she had promised the night before. Seraphine rose when Elder Thorn called the proceedings to order, moving to the center of the chamber with practiced elegance. The sealed letter she had shown Elena the previous evening, now held formally in her hands. "I bring before this council a matter of serious concern," Seraphine began, her voice carrying clearly through the silent chamber. "Testimony from 3 witnesses, individuals of impeccable standing within this fortress, who have observed troubling patterns of manipulation directed at our Alpha by the woman known as Elena Voss." She proceeded to read from the letter, describing accusations of deliberate emotional manipulation, claims that Elena had used her position as a healer to create false medical excuses for private meetings, allegations that she had deliberately cultivated an appearance of vulnerability and innocence to exploit Cale's isolation, following years of political pressure and personal loss. Elena listened with growing disbelief, the fabricated testimony painting a version of herself so distorted, so calculated and cruel, that she barely recognized the woman being described. Around her, she could feel the weight of dozens of eyes, some sympathetic, many uncertain, a few openly hostile, all of them waiting to see how the proceedings would unfold. When Seraphine finished reading, Elder Thorn turned toward Elena with grave formality. "Elena Voss, you have heard the accusations presented against you. Do you wish to respond?" Elena's heart pounded, but she forced herself to stand straighter, drawing on every ounce of composure she possessed. "Every word of that testimony is false," she said, her voice steady despite the fear coursing through her. "I have never manipulated Alpha Ashford in any way. I have never fabricated medical excuses to secure private meetings. The connection between us formed the moment we met, entirely by accident, in a crowded hallway neither of us could have anticipated. Everything that has happened since has grown from genuine feeling, not calculated deception." "Convenient words," Seraphine interjected sharply, "from someone whose entire future within this fortress depends on this council believing them." "I have witnesses of my own," Elena said, turning to gesture toward Mira and old Greta. "People who have watched my character and conduct for years, people with no personal stake in whether I remain within this fortress or not, people who can testify to the truth of who I actually am." Elder Thorn nodded slowly. "The council will hear this testimony as well." Mira spoke first, her voice firm and unwavering as she described 3 years of working alongside Elena, 3 years of witnessing nothing but dedication, honesty, and genuine care for every patient who came through the healer's station, regardless of their standing or influence within the fortress hierarchy. She spoke of Elena's exhaustive work ethic, her refusal to cut corners even when overwhelmed, her consistent kindness towards staff and patients alike that had never once wavered, not even after rumors and obstacles had been deliberately placed in her path over recent weeks. Old Greta spoke next, her decades of respected standing lending significant weight to her words as she described the genuine, undeniable nature of the bond she had personally witnessed forming between Elena and Cale, explaining in careful detail the old traditions surrounding such connections. Traditions that predated even the strategic marriage customs the council held so dear. Traditions built on the understanding that some connections could not be manufactured through manipulation because they arrived, fully formed, in an instant that neither party controlled. "I have studied these old traditions for over 40 years, old Greta said, her weathered voice carrying clearly through the chamber. "I have seen genuine bonds, and I have seen calculated manipulation dressed up to resemble one. What exists between Elena Voss and Alpha Ashford is unmistakably the former. Anyone who has genuinely witnessed them together, rather than relying on second-hand rumor and jealous speculation, would recognize the same truth." A murmur moved through the gathered crowd, and Elena could see several council members exchanging thoughtful glances, the weight of old Greta's testimony clearly shifting the atmosphere within the chamber. Cale rose then, drawing every eye toward him, as he moved to stand beside Elena, close enough that their shoulders nearly touched, a gesture of solidarity that required no additional words to convey its meaning. "I have remained largely silent throughout these proceedings," he said, his voice carrying the particular authority of someone accustomed to command, though softened now by genuine emotion he no longer bothered to hide. "Elena Voss has never manipulated me. She has never sought advantage or influence beyond simple honesty. The accusations presented against her are constructed entirely from jealousy and desperation, not truth." He turned to face Seraphine directly, his expression hardening. "I understand your family's disappointment regarding the alliance we discussed. I understand the personal ambition you've built around becoming Luna of these territories, but I will not allow that disappointment to justify destroying an innocent woman's reputation through fabricated testimony." "You cannot prove the testimony is fabricated," Seraphine said, though her voice had lost some of its earlier confidence. "I can," Cale said, "because I know exactly where I was during every private meeting your witnesses claim to have observed, and I know exactly what was discussed during each one. I invite this council to question your 3 witnesses individually, without coordination, and see how consistently their stories hold together under genuine scrutiny." Elder Thorne considered this suggestion carefully, exchanging glances with the other council members before nodding slowly. "The suggestion has merit. We will question the witnesses separately, immediately, before these proceedings continue further." The 3 witnesses, brought forward one at a time, began contradicting each other almost immediately under careful, individual questioning. Details that had aligned neatly in Seraphine's prepared letter fell apart under scrutiny. Timelines that didn't match, descriptions of meetings that occurred in locations Elena had never actually visited, claims that grew increasingly inconsistent the more carefully they were examined. By the time the 3rd witness had finished stumbling through contradictory testimony, the chamber's atmosphere had shifted decisively. Whispers of sympathy for Elena replaced the earlier uncertainty, and several council members were openly frowning in Seraphine's direction, their earlier willingness to entertain her accusations clearly evaporating in the face of such obvious fabrication. Elder Thorne rose finally, his expression grave as he addressed the full chamber. "This council finds the testimony presented against Elena Voss to be unreliable, and likely fabricated for personal motive, rather than genuine concern for this territory's stability. The formal accusations are dismissed." A wave of relief flooded through Elena so powerful that her knees nearly buckled, and Cale's hand found hers immediately, steadying her as the weight of the moment settled fully over the chamber. Elder Thorne turned his attention toward Seraphine, his expression hardening further. "Lady Seraphine, presenting fabricated testimony before this council is a serious offense, one that reflects poorly on your family's standing and threatens the trust this council must maintain with the territories it governs. We will be discussing appropriate consequences separately, and I would advise you to prepare a full accounting of your involvement in constructing this false testimony." Seraphine's composure finally cracked entirely, her carefully maintained elegance dissolving into something raw and furious as she realized the full scope of her failure. She looked toward Elena with an expression of pure venom, then toward Cale with something that looked almost like grief beneath the anger. the final collapse of a future she had spent years constructing for herself. "This isn't finished," she said quietly, though her voice carried clearly through the now hushed chamber. "I won't simply disappear because a council chose sentiment over strategic necessity." She turned and swept from the chamber before Elder Thorn could respond, leaving behind a stunned silence that slowly gave way to renewed murmuring among the gathered crowd, though the tone had shifted entirely, curiosity and sympathy now clearly favoring Elena over the woman who had just publicly humiliated herself through fabricated accusations. Cale pulled Elena gently aside as the chamber began to empty, his expression a mixture of relief and lingering concern. "It's over," he said quietly. "Whatever else happens, this particular threat has been resolved." "She said this isn't finished," Elena said, unable to shake the unease that Seraphine's parting words had left settled in her chest. "I heard her." Cale's jaw tightened. "And I don't intend to underestimate her again. But for tonight, at least, let's allow ourselves to feel the relief we've earned." He drew her into his arms, right there in the emptying council chamber, heedless of who might still be watching, and Elena let herself lean into the warmth and safety of him, allowing herself, finally, to believe that whatever challenges remained ahead, they would face them exactly as Cale had promised. Together, Lady Seraphine departed the fortress the following morning, escorted quietly by a small guard detail, at her father's insistence, once word of the failed proceedings reached him. But the peace that followed her departure proved shorter-lived than either Elena or Cale had hoped. 10 days later, a messenger arrived at the fortress gates in the early hours before dawn, exhausted from hard riding, carrying urgent word from the Eastern Border Patrol. A coordinated force, larger and better organized than the small skirmishing scouts from weeks earlier, had crossed into northern territory under cover of darkness, moving swiftly toward one of the smaller outposts that guarded the approach to the fortress itself. Cale was awake and dressed within minutes, summoning Garrick and his senior guard commanders to the war room, and Elena found herself pulled from sleep by the sudden commotion echoing through the fortress halls, dread settling heavy in her stomach as she dressed quickly and made her way toward the healer's station, understanding instinctively that wounded would soon be arriving in numbers far greater than the previous skirmish had produced. "This wasn't a simple border test," Garrick said grimly, spreading a map across the war room table as Cale and his commanders gathered around it. "This force moved with purpose, and it moved fast. Whoever organized this knew exactly where our defenses were thinnest." "You think someone provided them with that information?" Cale said, his voice carrying dangerous certainty, even as he phrased it as a question. "I think it's worth considering," Garrick said carefully, "that Lady Seraphine's father maintains connections with several eastern territories, connections that predate the alliance discussions entirely. If his daughter's humiliation before this council convinced him the Northern Alliance was no longer worth pursuing, he may have quietly redirected those connections elsewhere." The implications settled heavily over the room, and Cale's expression darkened with barely controlled fury, though he forced himself to focus on the immediate crisis rather than the political betrayal that might have caused it. "We'll investigate the source once the immediate threat is addressed. Right now, I need every available guard mobilized toward the eastern outpost before that force reaches it." The fortress transformed within the hour into a hub of urgent, coordinated activity, soldiers assembling and mobilizing while healers prepared the medical station for casualties that would inevitably follow any significant conflict. Elena worked alongside Mira and the other healers, organizing supplies with practiced efficiency despite the fear tightening in her chest at the thought of Cale riding directly into danger. He found her briefly before departing, his armor already fastened, his expression carrying the particular hardness of someone preparing for battle, though it softened considerably the moment his eyes found hers. "I have to go," he said, cupping her face gently in his hands. "I won't pretend this isn't dangerous, but I need you to trust that I'll return." "I trust you," Elena said, though her voice trembled slightly, despite her best efforts to remain composed. "Just promise me you'll be careful." "I promise." He pressed a firm, lingering kiss against her forehead, then against her lips, brief but filled with an intensity that spoke louder than any words could have managed. "Whatever happens, remember what we've built together these past weeks is real. Nothing that happens today changes that." He left before she could respond further, and Elena watched from the fortress walls as the mobilized guard rode out through the main gates, Kale at their head, until they disappeared into the distance beyond the tree line, leaving behind a fortress heavy with worried silence. The following hours stretched into some of the longest of Elena's life, filled with the particular anxious waiting that comes from knowing danger is unfolding somewhere beyond sight, beyond reach, with no way to influence the outcome except through hope and readiness for whatever consequences followed. Word arrived in fragments throughout the day, carried by exhausted riders sent back from the front lines, with updates on the unfolding conflict. The eastern outpost had held longer than expected, buying crucial time for Kale's reinforcements to arrive. The battle had grown fierce, casualties mounting on both sides, but the northern forces, bolstered by Kale's arrival and his skilled command, had begun pushing the invading force back toward the border. By late afternoon, the first wave of wounded soldiers began arriving at the fortress, and Elena threw herself into treating them with the same focused determination she had shown during the earlier skirmish, though the scale of injuries this time proved far more severe, testing every skill she had developed over years of training. She worked without pause through the afternoon and into the evening, moving from cot to cot, cleaning and stitching wounds, administering pain relief, offering what comfort she could to soldiers frightened and exhausted from combat, all while carrying the constant, gnawing worry about Kale's own safety somewhere still beyond the fortress walls. It was well past midnight when word finally arrived that the invading force had been fully repelled, driven back across the border with heavy losses, the northern territories secured once again. Relief flooded through the exhausted fortress, though it remained tempered by the grim reality of the day's casualties. Several soldiers lost, despite the healers' best efforts, others carrying wounds that would take months to fully heal. Elena was tending to one of the final patients, a young guard with a deep gash along his forearm, when she felt rather than heard Kale's presence entering the healer's station, and she turned immediately, her heart lurching at the sight of him. He was exhausted, his armor dented and stained with the marks of battle, a shallow cut visible along his jaw, but he was alive, standing on his own strength, and the relief that flooded through Elena at the sight of him nearly buckled her knees entirely. She crossed the room quickly, careful not to disturb the patients still under her care, and Kale met her halfway, pulling her into his arms with a fierce, desperate gratitude that spoke of exactly how dangerous the day's fighting had truly been. "You're hurt," Elena said, her fingers gently touching the cut along his jaw. "It's nothing. Superficial." His voice was rough with exhaustion, but his hands moved over her carefully, checking for any injury of her own, despite knowing she had remained safely within the fortress walls throughout the day. "You're unhurt." "I'm fine," Elena said, just exhausted and terrified for most of the day, but fine. He held her tightly for a long moment, neither of them speaking, simply absorbing the relief of the other's presence after hours of fear and uncertainty. Around them, the healer's station continued its quiet, exhausted work, other patients tended by Mira and the remaining staff, giving Elena and Kale this brief, precious moment of reunion amid the lingering chaos of the day. "We repelled them," Kale said finally, pulling back slightly to meet her eyes, but the cost was significant. "We lost good soldiers today, and I intend to find out exactly who provided the intelligence that made this attack possible." "Garrick suspected Lady Seraphine's father," Elena said quietly. "I intend to investigate that suspicion thoroughly," Kale said, his exhausted expression hardening with renewed determination. "If her family orchestrated this attack out of spite, following her humiliation before the council, there will be serious consequences that extend far beyond a simple diplomatic reprimand." The investigation that followed over the coming days confirmed exactly what Garrick had suspected. Evidence gathered from captured soldiers among the invading force revealed clear connections to intelligence provided by contacts within the Eastern Territories, contacts that traced back, through careful and thorough investigation, directly to correspondence sent from Lady Seraphine's family estate in the days immediately following her failed accusations before the council. The revelation sent shockwaves through the fortress and beyond, transforming what had begun as a personal rivalry over romantic attention into a matter of genuine political consequence. Lady Seraphine's father, faced with undeniable evidence of his family's involvement in orchestrating an attack against Northern Territory, found himself formally stripped of his standing among the Council of Allied Territories, his family's influence collapsing entirely, as other territories distanced themselves from the scandal. Lady Seraphine herself, according to reports that reached the fortress weeks later, had fled her family's estate before formal consequences could be fully determined. Her ambitions for a future, as Luna of the Northern Territories, replaced instead by disgrace and isolation, the direct and painful result of choices built on jealousy and desperation, rather than genuine character. Elena felt no satisfaction in the news, only a quiet, sobering relief that the threat had finally, fully passed, and a lingering sadness for how thoroughly ambition and fear had consumed someone who might, under different circumstances, have found genuine happiness through honest means, rather than manipulation and betrayal. "It's finished," Cale told her one evening, weeks after the battle, as they walked together through the fortress gardens where old Greta still tended her rows of healing herbs, with the same steady patience she always carried. "The threat from Seraphine's family, the political resistance from the council, all of it has finally settled." "Do you truly believe that?" Elena asked, unable to fully release the lingering wariness that months of danger and uncertainty had instilled within her. "I believe we've proven, through everything we've faced together, exactly how genuine and enduring this bond between us truly is," Cale said, stopping beneath the same flowering tree where they had first sat with old Greta months earlier, discussing the strange, undeniable connection neither of them had fully understood at the time. "I believe it's time to make that permanence formal, before this entire territory, so that no one ever again mistakes what exists between us as something fragile enough to be threatened by jealousy or ambition." Elena's breath caught as understanding dawned, watching Cale lower himself slowly to one knee before her, his gray eyes carrying the same intensity she had fallen into that very first day in the crowded hallway, an intensity that had only deepened and strengthened through every trial they had faced together since. "Elena Voss," he said, his voice steady, despite the emotion evident beneath it. "From the very moment you fell into my arms, I knew something in my life had changed permanently, though it took time for both of us to fully understand exactly what that meant. I've faced political resistance, fabricated accusations, and genuine danger since that day, and through every single trial, my feelings for you have only grown stronger, more certain, more essential to who I am, and who I want to become. Will you stand beside me, formally and permanently, as my chosen Luna, for as long as fate allows us both to walk this path together?" Tears filled Elena's eyes, months of fear and uncertainty finally giving way to overwhelming joy, and she found herself nodding before she could even manage the words her heart already knew with absolute certainty. "Yes," she said, her voice breaking slightly with emotion. "Yes, Cale. I choose you. I've chosen you every single day since that first accidental fall, and I'll continue choosing you every day for as long as I live." He rose to his feet, drawing her into his arms with a joy so complete it seemed to fill the entire garden around them, and somewhere nearby, old Greta watched with tears of her own, gathering in her weathered eyes, witnessing the culmination of a bond she had recognized as genuine from the very first moment these two extraordinary people had brought their story to her doorstep. News of the engagement spread through the fortress within hours, and unlike the whispers and rumors that had once surrounded Elena's connection to Cale, this news carried a warmth and genuine celebration that touched every level of the territory. The kitchen staff who had watched Elena's quiet dedication for years, the wounded soldiers she had personally treated after the border battles, the fellow healers who had stood by her through months of uncertainty, all of them welcomed the news with a joy that made clear exactly how thoroughly Elena had earned her place, not through noble birth or political maneuvering, but through genuine character that had revealed itself unmistakably through every trial she had faced. The council, chastened by the events surrounding Lady Seraphine's disgrace, and increasingly convinced of the genuine strength Elena brought to Cale's leadership, offered their formal blessing, with far less resistance than either Elena or Cale had anticipated. Even Councilwoman Merrick, who had once argued so firmly for strategic tradition over personal feeling, found herself acknowledging, during a private conversation with Cale weeks after the engagement, that Elena's conduct throughout the recent crisis had demonstrated exactly the strength and integrity the territory required from its future Luna. "I was wrong to doubt her character," Merrick admitted. "Strategic value and genuine character are not always opposing forces, Alpha Ashford. I see now that Elena Voss possesses both in equal measure. The wedding preparations that followed occupied the fortress for weeks, a joyful contrast to the tension and danger that had defined the months before it. Elena found herself, for the first time since her mother's passing years earlier, surrounded by genuine community and celebration. Mira and Willa fussing over wedding preparations with obvious delight. Old Greta contributing rare, fragrant herbs from her garden for the ceremony. Garrick offering gruff but sincere congratulations that revealed, beneath his usual composed exterior, genuine happiness for the alpha he had served and befriended since childhood. On the morning of the ceremony, Elena stood in a quiet chamber overlooking the fortress courtyard, dressed in a simple, elegant gown that Mira had helped her choose, her hands trembling slightly, with a mixture of nerves and overwhelming joy. She thought back over everything that had led to this moment, the accidental fall in a crowded hallway that had changed the entire course of her life, the sleepless nights of uncertainty, the fabricated accusations and political resistance, the terror of watching Kale ride into battle, not knowing if he would return. Every trial, every difficult moment, had led her here, to this quiet chamber, on the morning she would formally join her life to a man whose gray eyes had captured something in her from the very first instant they met. Something neither of them had fully understood then but had come to recognize, through everything they'd endured together, as the rarest and most precious kind of connection two people could share. A soft knock interrupted her thoughts, and old Greta entered the chamber, her weathered face creased with a warm, knowing smile. "You look radiant," the old healer said, crossing the room to gently adjust a stray strand of Elena's hair. "Though I suspect you'd look radiant in healer's robes just as easily. It was never the clothing that made Kale Ashford fall for you, child." "I still can't quite believe it's real," Elena admitted quietly. "All of it. Sometimes I still expect to wake up back in the healer's quarters, certain the entire past year has been some strange, elaborate dream." "It's real," old Greta said firmly, taking Elena's hands in her own weathered ones. "I've watched enough forced alliances and calculated matches over my long life to recognize genuine connection when I see it, and what exists between you and Kale Ashford is as real as anything I've ever witnessed. You earned this happiness through honesty and courage, not through luck or accident. Never doubt that." Elena felt tears threatening again, and old Greta laughed gently, wiping them away before they could fall and disturb the careful preparations Mira had spent the morning perfecting. "Save your tears for the ceremony, child. Your Alpha King is waiting, and I suspect he's grown quite impatient over these past several minutes." The ceremony itself unfolded beneath the same flowering tree in old Greta's garden, where Elena and Kale had first sought understanding of the strange bond between them, the location chosen deliberately to honor the place where their story had truly begun to take shape. The garden overflowed with fortress staff and territory representatives alike, nobles and healers and soldiers standing together without the rigid separation that had once defined fortress gatherings, a fitting symbol of the more open, genuine leadership Kale had embraced since the day Elena fell into his arms. Kale waited beneath the tree as Elena approached, dressed in formal attire that couldn't quite disguise the emotion evident in his expression, his gray eyes carrying the same intensity that had first captured her attention in that crowded hallway so many months earlier, though now that intensity was softened by pure, unguarded joy rather than careful, controlled restraint. "You're here," he said quietly as she reached him, as though some small part of him had feared, even after everything they'd overcome together, that this moment might somehow slip away. "I'll always be here," Elena said, taking his hands in hers. "That's what I chose, the moment I chose you." The formal ceremony that followed was simple, deeply personal, built around old traditions old Greta had helped them incorporate. Traditions honoring the rare and genuine bonds that occasionally formed between two souls destined to find each other, regardless of the obstacles placed in their path. When Kale finally drew Elena into his arms at the ceremony's conclusion, sealing their union before the entire gathered crowd, the cheer that rose through the garden carried a warmth and genuine celebration that echoed far beyond the fortress walls, reaching every corner of the territory that would come to know Elena, not merely as an unexpected Luna, but as a leader whose strength and compassion would guide the northern territories through years of prosperity and peace to come. In the years that followed, Elena and Kale's story became something of a legend within the northern territories, retold by healers and soldiers and fortress staff alike. A reminder that genuine connection, once found, proved stronger than any political scheme or ambitious rival determined to destroy it. Elena continued her work among the healers even after becoming Luna, never abandoning the skills and dedication that had first defined her character, insisting that her new position only meant she now had greater resources to help even more people than before. Cale's leadership, strengthened rather than weakened by his choice to follow genuine conviction over strategic calculation, brought a new era of stability to the Northern Territories, an era built on honesty and trust rather than purely calculated alliance, an era that other territories eventually came to respect and, in some cases, seek to emulate within their own leadership. And sometimes, on quiet evenings when the fortress had settled into peaceful stillness, Elena and Cale would return together to the gardens, where their story had truly taken root, sitting beneath the same flowering tree, remembering the accidental fall in a crowded hallway that had changed both their lives so completely, grateful, always, that fate had chosen that particular moment, that particular corridor, to bring them crashing together, in a way neither of them had wanted to let go of, not then, and not in all the years that followed. Their bond, exactly as old Greta had promised so long ago, had proven rare, undeniable, and enduring, strong enough to withstand jealousy, political ambition, and genuine danger, strong enough to become the foundation for a partnership that shaped an entire territory's future, all beginning from a single, unexpected moment, when a healer's assistant lost her footing on a crowded staircase, and fell directly into the arms of the Alpha King, and neither of them, from that very first instant, ever truly wanted to let go.